Welcome to the Good Faith Podcast, where friends who follow Jesus help each other make sense of the world. I'm Good Faith's Director of Content and the producer of this podcast, D.T. Sloffman. Curtis Chang is off this week. Here at Good Faith, as we try to make sense of the world, for those of us who live in the United States, there's a lot to wrestle with right now. We've spent time recently focusing on how American evangelicals are broadly becoming less empathetic to others and mirroring the attitudes of those in political power. We've talked about how religious relief work is being gutted in the name of budget cuts, and how the government is enacting policies that can truly hurt the least of these at home and abroad, calling into question how a follower of Jesus can live both faithfully and compassionately in the midst of the upheaval. In all of this, one thing has become abundantly clear. Much of what we're encountering in the United States right now is causing a disproportionate amount of collective anxiety. The late Frederick Buechner offered a few questions about anxiety in his book, Whistling in the Dark. He's one of my favorites. He wrote this: "Is anxiety a disease or an addiction? Perhaps it's something of both. Partly, perhaps, because you can't help it, and partly because for some dark reason you choose not to help it. You torment yourself with detailed visions of the worst that can possibly happen. Does the terrible fear of disaster conceal an even more terrible hankering for it? Do the accelerated pulse and the knot in the stomach mean that beneath whatever their immediate cause, you are acting out some ancient and unresolved drama of childhood? Since the worst things that happen are apt to be the things you don't see coming, do you think there is a kind of magic whereby if you only can see them coming, you will be able somehow to prevent them from happening?" Well, we need those questions answered maybe more today than when Buechner wrote them. So I've asked for a chat with my friend Steve Cuss because he's made it his life's work to help leaders understand and manage anxiety. Steve's a former trauma and hospice chaplain and has been working in the areas of spiritual care for a very long time. He hosts the podcast called Being Human and is the author of the books Managing Leadership Anxiety, Yours and Theirs, and The Expectation Gap, the Tiny, Vast Space Between Our Beliefs and Experience of God. Steve is also an Australian by birth who lives in America by choice, and I would be lying if I didn't acknowledge that I could listen to his distinctive voice for hours. Steve Cuss, welcome to the Good Faith Podcast.
DT, it's great to chat with you, and I think we're off to a fantastic start. Anytime Buechner is involved, it's going to be a good chat.
I think so too. He's meant a lot to me. A lot to me, right?
Same.
Yeah. So Steve, I want to walk through today's conversation in two parts. First, I want you to help us all understand what anxiety is and why so many of us are trapped by it. And then later, because so much of the current American experiences isn't going to change anytime soon, I want to see what hope maybe you can help, all of us cling to, what hope you can offer. And as we try to understand how to walk through our anxiety, maybe it'll help us lead others through theirs too. Sound good?
Yeah, sounds like good time.
All right. So right out of the gate, what I need you to do, because different people define it different ways. Let's start with anxiety itself. How do you define anxiety, Steve?
Good. Yeah. The simplest definition of anxiety is a coping mechanism. It is a coping mechanism. The challenge is that we use the singular anxiety, and I think the move we need to make in our entire culture is to move it to the plural, anxieties, because anxiety as a word is like the weather. Is it raining? Is it snowing? Is it windy? There are several different kinds of anxiety, and they all manifest differently. They show up differently. They're caused by different things. So, for example, acute anxiety is caused by a real life and death threat to your body or your loved one's body. I grew up in Western Australia. We have the top 10 deadliest snakes in the world in my backyard. And, when you see a tiger snake, that's time to run. That's what's called acute anxiety. It's a dangerous situation. You have to get to safety. If you've ever lost a child in a playground, acute anxiety. The big idea, DT, is acute anxiety is always based on something real. Now, trauma is a form of anxiety. It's a whole different ballgame, different set of rules. It's based on something real and false at the same time, which is why it's so complicated, because something real happened to you, but then you make meaning out of it and you push that meaning into your relationships and into your future. Now you're operating out of something true and false. And then the field that I think is most helpful for today's chat is what's clinically called chronic
Mm.
anxiety. And it's fascinating, DT, because for a couple of reasons, it's only ever based on something false. So as our audience is thinking about this, chronic anxiety looks like reactivity. And that's the problem we're really dealing with on this episode is how do we lower our reactivity? How do we become less reactive to what's going on? And what's fascinating out of all the anxieties, like we could talk about bipolarity and depression, there's all kinds.
Yeah,
But if
sure.
we just focus on reactivity, it's the only kind of anxiety that's contagious. And that, in a nutshell, is the problem today. We are catching and spreading it like wildfire, but it's always based on a false need that feels real. So, like when I see a snake in Australia, that's real. My heart races. But for example, if I'm a people pleaser, that would be a false need, but my body is acting like it's real. And so for many people, having the last word, being right, being understood, being respected, these are all, in fact, false needs. We don't need those to thrive as humans, but our body tells us we do. So when it comes to political conversation, everything that's coming out of DC, we're kind of pummeled with all this stuff, and it's triggering our false needs and our reactivity.
Now, we'll dive deeper into that in just a second. But for our listeners, and I know this story because we're friends and I've heard it before, but how did you decide to make anxiety your life's work? I know about a certain place that you experienced that kind of changed everything for you, and I think as a starting place, because you're talking about anxiety spreading and
Yeah.
reactivity, right? This is a place where that happened, and it was called the death room. Can you tell our listeners what you learned in the death room and how it changed your life?
Yeah, my first full-time job out of Bible college. I went to college to become a preacher. And my first full-time job was as you mentioned in the intro, a trauma and hospice chaplain. And my first day on the job was a 28-hour overnight shift. Just like the medical residents do those marathon shifts, the chaplains do as well. So my first day was a 28-hour shift. I'd been married a week. It was the last day of my honeymoon. Quite a contrast from the day before, that's for sure. And then my first page of my first day, I was sent to a death room, which was where the doctors go in. They bring the family into this little private room to give them the news. And I walked in, and the
Give
doctors got
them the
out of there.
news that a loved one has
A loved
has
one
died.
unexpectedly died on the surgery table. The matriarch of their family. It wasn't a routine surgery, but it wasn't one where anyone thought she was going to die, and she
Mhm.
died. The doctors tell the family, and then next thing you know, I'm by myself with 12 screeching people in a room, and one of them was headbutting the wall over and over. One was throwing up into a trash can, and that became for that year. I did a year of a residency in chaplaincy. I attended around 200 deaths or so. And then I think the other surprise, DT, is when you're not attending death, you're only ever attending people at the worst moments of their life. No one's sitting around a hospital room happy saying, you know, who's a walking party? The chaplain. Let's get the chaplain in for some fun. Like it's always at people's worst. And the biggest surprise to me, and I think this does help us in our political conversation, the biggest surprise to me was how much anxiety I was bringing into the room. I just thought my job was to focus on their anxiety. But for example, one of my false needs is to make whoever's in front of me feel better. If somebody in front of me is suffering and upset, my brain tells me I must make them better for me to be okay. And this plays out in all kinds of crazy ways in my life. But that was really pressurized when I was a chaplain because, of course, when someone's dying, or like sometimes there's nothing to say, and the need to say something is the worst move. So that year for me was like, it felt like special forces training in how to manage my own anxiety and how to actually be present to people because reactivity puts you in a false reality. So I walk into a room And I'm now believing I must say the right thing, and that's not true. And so, as a pastor, I've given my life to teaching and studying reactivity because it's always based on false belief. And I believe the gospel sets us free. I believe truth sets us free. So I try to help people notice their reactivity triggers so that they can be free, not just in their head, but in their body. A lot of us believe in freedom in Christ in our brain, but our body is not free. And then a lot of the work I do, DT, is with leaders in how to help lower reactivity on your teams since it's contagious.
Yeah. Well, so that contagious nature, right? That's interesting to me. You're talking about the anxiety that you're bringing into a
Yeah.
situation that's already full of it, right? What's the difference between what I'm taking, what I'm reacting to, and what I'm bringing that you're reacting to? Is there one that's worse than the other? Does one escalate the other more than, say, mine or yours?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Every one of us have triggers that we're carrying inside of us. And when we are triggered, we then start to spill reactivity. And then, of course, that means that when we are encountering someone else, they have their triggers, but they're also placing it on us. And so, like, for example, when I was with the screeching family in the ICU, I didn't know what to do. And anytime I don't know what to do, even today, I feel really stupid. And then when I feel stupid, I feel really exposed and vulnerable. So I'm standing in this room feeling really stupid. And the nurse came barreling in angry at me and beckoned me out of the room. I'd never met her before, but I'm a people pleaser and I can tell I'm in trouble. Like it's like she's my mum, telling me
Mm,
off.
yeah.
And I read the situation right. She told me off. She was under tremendous pressure to get the body out of the bed. She had patients waiting for the bed. She had to change the sheets. So she's expecting me to relieve her needs.
Mm.
So she's dumping it on me. Well, I'm infected because I'm trying to make her happy and I'm feeling stupid. And actually, DT, what happened is I hustled this family. This family was in unhinged shock. I hustled them into the room like 2 or 3 hours before I should have because I was no longer able to see what the situation required. I'm reacting out of my own reactivity. So it takes quite a bit of practice to notice, okay, what is coming out of me and what is coming at me from others.
Sure.
A genuinely good place to practice is social media. You can go on social media for the sake of noticing when you're triggered. So, for example, DT, for me, I have this crazy false belief that one more comment from me will set the world straight. That's crazy, but I really do believe it. And I'm embarrassed to tell you the number of times I have typed a response and then deleted it, realizing, what am I doing? This is not going to help. This is going to make it worse. That's just my unhinged reactivity.
Well, and that's so much of, all of us. And now getting back to the political moment, I mean, I think we're reacting, especially followers of Jesus, right? We're reacting to the fact that, 80% of evangelicals, white evangelicals, voted for Donald Trump. And then we look at the administration enacting, plans to gut U.S. aid, which is largely funding religious relief efforts all over the world, and doing other things like that. And we go, there's some cognitive dissonance here. Was I just blind to this? These are my people. This is my in group. And I think that, that reactivity, right? It does gin up anxiety. But I think maybe more than even, and maybe I'm wrong, but maybe more than even an interpersonal interaction, because it might be something where, like in this case, this is a group that we felt we were a part of, maybe for decades, and we go, whoa, am I on the outside now?
There's two things going on here. The heart of reactivity is assumption
Mhm.
or false belief. And the human brain, it needs certainty to relax. And so that's why I think it's hard to walk by faith because knowledge and certainty and faith are not the same thing. And so we end up operating out of assumption so our brain can relax.
Mm.
Well, when you discover your assumptions aren't true or when somebody says, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, something like this, you're piling on all your assumption to their communication, and then you're reacting not from what they're saying, but from your assumption. And if you
Mm.
start talking, like one of the things I do in my workshops, DT, is I'll often drop a grenade of a volatile topic in the room, because when you are well, you should be able to talk about anything without being triggered, but talk about pro-life, pro-choice, same-sex attraction, gay marriage. You talk about these, what would be considered volatile topics. What's going on is everyone is dumping their assumption into the room on each other and then feeling misunderstood and escalating it. That's one thing that's going on. I think the other thing that's going on that we really should be aware of, I do a lot of work where, particularly like a Christian organization will bring me in after maybe the leader has been put on a forced leave for some kind of a bad behavior. And they'll bring me in to try to make sense of what happened. How do we get here? How do we move forward? And it's interesting, DT. I was working with one particular church where the leader was an internationally known person. And once he got caught, as often these guys do, he denied. Well, he ended up kind of just hiding, and he just disappeared. Well, now the entire congregation and staff are holding the bucket of anxiety. Like he's generating it, they're holding it, and you can't carry anxiety for very long. So the new leader came in, they just dumped it on the new guy.
Mm.
Because they have to put it somewhere, and they can't dump it on the perpetrator. I think there's a lot here with our federal politics. Like, you and I can't just knock on the door of the White House and have a direct conversation and say, I'd like to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
So all of this anxiety is coming from DC, and we're all carrying it, and it has to go somewhere. So we end up dumping it on each other to kind of get relief. It takes a lot of work to stay connected to somebody who has highly different values than you. But of course, fortunately, that's the very point of the church. Like, well, it's not the very
Right.
point, but it's one of the key
Well,
distinctives of what a church should be.
it's directionally accurate for sure. But I wonder, in the example you gave, is there something in there from either a triggering perspective, or the way we try to rationally work through these things, where we're saying, oh, but that's like violation of values. That's you We say we mean this, we say we believe this, you violated that. What do I do with that? Is that where some of this anxiety is coming from? Is that one of the reactions?
Yeah, I think so. Two of the quickest ways to locate your reactivity is, first one is when someone violates your core values.
Okay.
That's number one. Number two is when you are in cognitive dissonance with another person. Same set of facts, radically opposite view of those facts. And the brain ends up trying to worry your way around to the other person's point of view, or you need to like scapegoat and demonize them so your brain can relax. So those are two massive anxiety generators in political discourse. I think the other dynamic, DT, it gets a little complicated, but just the nature of national and global politics is
Mhm.
immensely complex,
Right.
and we all have a little slice of it.
Mhm.
And so I also think what's true is, yes, some of that 82% of white evangelicals adore Donald Trump. They believe he is God's man, that
Mm.
he's the King David, and you've heard some of that stuff.
Right. Sure.
And what's also true is some of that 82% are looking at the values of the other party and saying those values are a core violation of my beliefs.
That's true.
And there's
Sure.
no one else but Trump around, and here we go. And so it's very nuanced and complicated. I'm always cautious about generalizations.
Mhm.
I'm so surprised. Like, we know better than to make racial generalizations. Like, we would never say, well, here's what black people think. That would be a racist thing to do. But we are very quick to do that in church people. We do make those generalizations. So I'm more interested in who's in front of me right now. What do you think? What are your values? And even if your values are a direct violation of mine, the goal is not to lower my values, so I'm some carefree hippie. The
Mm.
goal is to not let my core values get in the way of my connection with you. I think that's the problem that the Pharisees, they were so hung up on their religious values, they missed the heart of
Mm,
God.
sure.
And so I do think there's a lot of opportunity for all followers of Jesus to truly deeply connect without lowering your values.
Hmm.
I personally don't think you should lower your core convictions, but don't let them get the last word. And don't let your core convictions assume you know the motive of another person.
Mm.
And that I see that happening a lot on all sides.
When we take on the anxiety through reactivity, which as you said seems to be where a lot of this is coming from in these situations, how do we become aware that that's what's happening? Right? I think a lot of us actually fall into anxiety spirals without even realizing initially that's what's going on. Right?
Yeah.
We maybe we call it, oh, I'm grieving, or I feel alone, or I'm homeless in this situation, or but we're not really identifying that it's actually anxiety we need to
Yeah.
work through.
That's a really important question. So I train people to become hyper aware of yourself. So the easiest place to locate your reactivity is in your body. So the first thing you can do is several times a day, and this is how I'd recommend everyone practice, just 3 or 4 times a day. Just stop whatever you're doing and just say, okay, is my mind spinning? Is my heart racing? Is my body tightening? Those are the three signs: spinning mind, racing heart, tightening body. Because anxiety does get a hold of you before you're aware of it. And by the time you're aware of it, you're usually too far gone.
Mm,
So that's the simplest test. So, for example, I am prone to a spinning mind. I tend to go to bed worried about it. And when I wake up, I'm already worrying about it. Well, I've now got a choice. Am I going to let that ruminate, or am I going to intervene with some practices that get me reconnected to God? Anxiety is a competing gospel to the gospel of freedom. Anxiety says you can worry your way to peace, even though you never can. Anxiety says you're all alone. So the initial thing is a body scan. The deeper work is you can start setting guardrails for yourself. And this is a little deeper, DT, but anxiety either kicks you into self righteousness. Thank you, Jesus. I'm not like those people, sinners, or self pity. Those are the two extremes. And you can learn to notice when you've stopped noticing God's presence.
mm,
Because when you are in anxiety's grip, you forget the Lord. It's one of the reasons I believe that one of the most frequent commands in scripture is remember the Lord. It's all through the Bible, because when humans are anxious, we depend on ourself to be well instead of depending on God to be well. I just mean in the moment.
sure.
When I'm with a Trump supporter, I have to work extra hard to stay aware that God's with me and God's with that person too. I am prone to want to be right. I am prone to need to change them so I can relax. And so these are more advanced work. But once you've done a body scan, you can notice, oh, I'm in self-pity right now.
Mm,
Or, oh, I'm in self-righteousness right now. And you just relax into God's presence and remember, okay, wait, am I aware that God's with me? No. So the statement of Jacob in Genesis 28, surely the Lord was with me and I was not aware of it.
right.
That's the confession of somebody who's in reactivity's grip.
You used a phrase that I've heard you use before. In fact, for listeners of your podcast, Being Human, you start every episode this way. You talk about relaxing into the presence of God. What do you mean when you say that? Unpack that for me, because I understand in my mind what it means to relax, and I am horrible at doing it.
Yeah.
What is it to relax in the presence of God?
Yeah. So there's a couple of things. It's to experience in your body what you believe about God in your brain. You know, most of us, I'm this way, DT. I'm wildly rational. I'm what's known feelings repressed. You ask me how I'm doing, I'm fine, which is really code for I have no idea how I'm doing. Why did you interrupt my day and ask me? But, my brain believes in the peace of Christ, the freedom in Christ. But if I pause and notice my body, I'm like, I'm kind of wrapped up right now. I'm kind of anxious right now. And anxiety, the number one competitor for awareness of God is reactivity.
Mm.
When you're reactive and you're triggered, the first thing to go away is awareness of God's presence. I'm not talking about like a highly charismatic mystical experience,
Mm.
but the scripture clearly teaches that God is omnipresent, God is with us. And so it's just the simple reminder by faith. I'm going to get off anxiety's treadmill. I'm going to take a couple of breaths long enough to remember I'm not alone. God is with me. Now, the evidence of that is a couple of things. I feel my body line up with my head beliefs. My wife, Lisa, is a trauma therapist, and she says we have head beliefs and body beliefs, and she says the body wins every time. It's not even close. The body will win every time. So step one is pausing and taking some breaths, and just, for me, it's by faith. Now, I will just say, DT, some people say, oh, Steve, you're like teaching a shell game. You're kind of faking it till you make it.
Mm.
No, I'm just saying I'm putting my faith in something. And rather than putting my faith in myself, I'm going to put my faith that God is with me. And now what that looks like is when I'm talking to you, and maybe you have a strong political opinion and you're putting it on me, and you are not okay unless I agree with you. Like, that's a common
Oh,
situation. And
yes.
I can feel that anxiety coming from you. And relaxing into God's presence means that I can connect with you, DT. I have nothing to prove. I have nothing to lose. I die to my false needs, and my false need is being understood. So again, this is more advanced. When I need to be understood, my solution is to use more words, explain myself more, and thus anxiety gets contagious. I open my Bible, I see Jesus able to stand in front of Pontius Pilate, willfully misunderstood, and he's very content to be silent. And I look at that and say, Jesus had something that I don't have, because he had nothing to lose and nothing to prove. The Apostle Paul, in front of Festus and Felix, Paul, your great learning is driving you insane. Nothing to prove, nothing to lose. They can throw him in jail, they can beat him, but he's free. He's
Yeah.
free. So that's what it means, I think, to relax into God's presence. I'm just trying to carry what God has called me to carry, nothing more. I'm trying to listen to learn rather than listening to defend or listening to prove. And we can all practice with our in-person relationships. Social media is a great environment to practice because it's such a reactive medium. I personally recommend Twitter. It's the most reactive of all social medias. So I go on Twitter to practice my reactivity management.
So when everyone else is saying, man, maybe you need to take a sabbatical from social media, you, Steve Cuss, are saying, no, go hop on social media and practice, how this all plays out in a reactive space that's, as you said, highly reactive.
Just read, follow somebody that drives you crazy, read what they say, and notice your body. That'll do it. Notice your body. And then under your body, notice your beliefs. That's how I located my belief of one more comment from Steve Cuss is what this world needs. It's crazy. Like, saying it out loud is so arrogant.
Yeah.
And yet, that's why people post. Like, when I see these posts devolving into arguments, I'm like, what did you think was going to happen?
Yeah.
But they do. And of course, there are bad actors that like,
Mhm.
trolls. And so one of the rules in reactivity management is you can only move towards somebody who is moving toward you. You can only, in leadership, you can only lead people that are moving toward you. And so that's there's more advanced DT, but learning to measure who's moving toward me and who's not. And if you're not moving toward me, I will stop chasing you. And a lot of trolls have a vested interest in keeping us reactive and combative. They're not, they're bad actors.
Mm.
Stop feeding the trolls, right? Stop feeding the wildlife.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So how can we, as followers of Jesus, how can we discern? And not even, I mean, there's a lot of people that listen to this podcast that, they wouldn't say they're followers of Jesus, but for them too, how can we discern between legitimate concerns and anxiety-driven narratives?
That's a fantastic question because I think what's going on, I'd love to get your take on this.
Sure.
I think the problem is there are too many legitimate concerns for us to manage. And so we stay in a state of reactivity.
Mm,
I think before 24/7 news and social media, all of these legitimate concerns were still around, but we only knew of a few of them. And now, like, we do have bad actors that seem to me to be introducing straw men every 6 months
mm,
or a year. Do you remember, DT, do you remember the
that's
quaint good old days when critical race theory was the big thing to fight about?
I
Those were
do.
the good old days. And now we're probably 7 to 10 phrases beyond. I think DEI is probably the one today,
Yeah,
but
yeah,
that's going to go away and there'll
yeah,
be one tomorrow. So
yeah.
I think I love your question, but I think the problem is that we get exhausted trying to discern which of the many legitimate causes and problems should I or can I do something
Mm,
about. And I think that's where we are carrying all this anxiety and
yeah.
feeling a little stuck.
I try to focus, Steve, and I can't speak for anyone else and say this is the way to do it, but I try to focus on things that I know are legitimate concerns. Like there's no question the news isn't going to change it. Social media engagement isn't going to change it. And what that means for me, it's what are the things I need to do to take care of my family? How am I addressing our immediate needs? Am I providing for them in a way that I've got a roof over their head, there's food on the table? Spiritually, we're engaging and we're, in a vibrant place there. And if we're not, saying, why aren't we in that place? Right. And, as you know, in my past work, I worked in sports television, and one of my acquaintances, one time he was a television or is a television host. He used to talk about how he would worry about all of the, I can't make a mistake. Millions of people will see it. And he said that God freed him from that when he realized, oh, he wasn't there for the millions of people. They're going to be entertained no matter what. It was more about what was his relationship supposed to be like with those other three guys at that desk, at that table. And once he started thinking about that immediate nature of those three guys with him, that became a much more fulfilling job. So I think that's the way I try to look at it. But I have to tell you, Steve, I'm a miserable failure. I don't do a great job at it, even though, like you're saying, right, we know those are the things that are true and, that are legitimate concerns or should be.
There's so many legitimate concerns. Just this is an important point. Just in the same way that anxiety is contagious, so is connected presence. And I love what you were talking about. That particular newscaster, that's a profound idea that he recognized that his relational well-being became the focus. And fundamentally, what I teach is put yourself on your conscious list of relationships. Be aware of how you are doing and be responsible to manage yourself, and make sure you're not crossing into someone else's brain. This is a very common thing that anxiety does is, for example, it'll put my brain into your brain, DT, where I start believing I know what you're thinking,
Mm,
or I make assumptions about your motive, but I don't know. And so learning to stay out of each other's brain and stay connected to where we're listening to learn. The opposite of anxiety isn't calm, it's curiosity.
mm, that's a
And
good one.
curiosity is the superpower in sitting with somebody who's combative. If they come at you pretty hot and you ask 3 to 5 curious questions and you work on being connected, it will almost certainly calm them down if they're a good actor. If they're a troll, it'll identify that, that'll also expose that. And then I would just, like Jesus says, wipe the dust off your feet.
Mm. Mm.
But if everybody in the good faith community took responsibility to bringing connected presence to your household, your neighborhoods, your core relationships, that would resolve so much of the tension we're in right now.
That's a good word. So, Steve, as I said up front when I introduced you, you are Australian by birth, but live in America by choice.
Indeed.
So, you're a foreigner, right? Stranger in a strange land, and we are a strange land. What,
Yeah.
before we keep going down the reactionary anxiety road, let me ask you this. What's your observation on this current political moment we find ourselves in America as someone who comes here from Australia, and you see all of this and you see how politics is it's such a big deal to us. I think we would both agree. What's your take?
Yeah, it is interesting because I've actually lived in America longer than I lived in Australia. 20 years in Australia, 33 years in America. When I first came here in the 90s, this would be what I call the quaint days of American politics when it was Bill Clinton. Remember those, DT? Back when things were much less reactive, even though at the time. So my take is
Oh
that
man.
the political system in America is unique in that a lot of I was surprised when I moved here how many American Christians put so much hope and faith in politics. And in Australia, and it's true in many other countries, we don't expect much out of our politicians. They're kind of a pest or a distraction. And so it was quite surprising to me to see how vested some people when I first moved here were in politics. I think that's still true. And then when I open my Bible, it's quite surprising how uninterested Jesus and the Apostle Paul seem to be in the political reality of the day. It really feels to me like Jesus really kind of describes Herod as functionally a pest. He calls him a fox, not in the modern cute girl way, but in the pest, the annoying way. Paul interacts with Roman officials really only to try to share his faith with them. He's not trying to get anything from them. He's not trying to campaign. So I think that's the other big question we have to ask is what is God calling us to expect out of our earthly citizenship? And are we keeping our eye on our heavenly citizenship? Not in a way to disconnect from the work in this world, but I think it comes down to hope and expectation. It just feels to me like every 4 years somebody is promising something that they can't possibly keep, and we kind of fall into the trap of hope and believing them again. So that's another anxiety test, is just to check where our hope is ultimately, I think.
One of the things I can tell you about good faith listeners is that they are faithful and communicative. We get a lot of emails with both encouragement and questions. And one of the prevailing themes in these emails from listeners are feelings of, quote, sense of despair. What do you say to those folks so that say, I feel helpless. And more than that, I feel homeless when it comes to relationships. They feel cut off because of either politics or other issues like that,
Yeah.
where they once had friends or even relationships within their own families, they
Yeah.
now feel cut off. What can they do to find a faithful, hopeful engagement that matters?
Well, that's a great question. I have heartbreakingly spoken to way too many people who have lost precious relationships because of politics. It's it's awful. So I think the first thing I would want to say to the good faith audience is I am genuinely sorry and heartbroken that happened. I believe you. Like I believe that's true. I've heard those myself. Um, a couple of things that you can do that I have found profound, and these are practices that I have had for years. If you think back to trauma chaplaincy, there's no break. It's just an onslaught. And so, what you have to do is deepen your capacity for chaos. And one of the ways I do it is increase my daily practices of gratitude and love. So, when I said put yourself on your conscious list of relationships, you might start by doing that body scan. Like, is anxiety in my mind? Is my heart racing? You can start there. But I coach people to try to cultivate 6 to 8 micro habits of goodness a day. This would be part one of what I encourage. I hold my wife's hand every day. You know, for those of us who are married, I rub my dog's floppy ears every day. I read my scripture every day. You know, some of these are more traditional spiritual practices than others, but you know, I listen to a piece of my guitar every day. So I have made what's called a life-giving list. People could go to my website if they want to download one, for
Sure.
example.
We'll put a
And I
link in the
have,
show notes.
yeah, I have like 150 different ways on my life-giving list. And today I'm already 12 items in, DT. And I've still got a few to go tonight. And every time I do them, so like this morning I had breakfast with one of my best friends. And I'm not just having breakfast with Kevin. I'm walking and saying, God, you are so good to me. You have given me Kevin as a friend. Tonight, my son Andrew and I get to watch our team, the Denver Nuggets, play the Los Angeles Lakers. And I'm baptizing that event. When I'm at the game sitting next to this young man that I love, my son, I am full of worship to God. Now, the like perfect love casts out fear, and all of us can build these micro habits through the day of just these pockets. And again, it's another way to relax into God's presence. So that's one of them. The other thing I've been doing lately, and this may or may not fit the good faith community, I've been keeping a journal called God's Expansive Kingdom.
Mm.
I got tired of Twitter and all of the church leadership failures that make the news. And I want to be clear, DT. I believe them. I think leaders that are living a secret life should be exposed and punished. Like, there's grace, of course, but they should take responsibility. So I don't mean to say that I am diminishing that, but the information coming at us is out of balance.
Mm.
Right. So we hear all of these scandals. And if we're not careful, one of the signs of anxiety is generalizations. All megachurch pastors are blank. Okay, come on now. Because I could go megachurch pastor with anybody and show you amazing, humble, unpretentious men and women of God. So my journal, God's Expansive Kingdom, is when I hear of somebody doing really valuable work around the world. Maybe their work is having a big impact, hundreds of thousands of people. Maybe it's helping 2 people. I write about it in my journal and give thanks to God. And it just helps me realize, yes, our politics right now at a very challenging point. The anxiety is escalating. There's more uncertainty, there's more fear. What's also true, God's kingdom is in amazing hands. The state of the kingdom is well, it's thriving. And now I have the rare privilege of going all around the world. I travel and speak, and tomorrow I get on a plane for Portugal, and I get the privilege of sitting down with 50 core faith leaders that have all convening in Portugal. Last year, I got to be with Eastern European leaders from Estonia and Russia, and just hearing what God is doing in their stories just reminds me God is good. God's people are doing good work. Now, again, DT, I want to be careful. It's not a yeah, but I'm not saying that these other colossal problems aren't true. I don't want to minimize that, but I want to also escalate what
Mm.
is also equally true but not reported on, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the goodness of God's people here in America and around the world. Most of my work's in the United States, and most of my journal is from an average local church.
Mm. I love that. I love that. It reminds me of Galatians 5, right? Where we read, for you've been called to live in freedom, right? You're experiencing freedom when you've been able to identify the anxiety, right? And to work through it and to find that other side and, even journal about it. But then it goes on, right? In Galatians, it says, but don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature.
Yeah.
Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love.
Yeah. And whatever has got us amped up politically doesn't change the fact that the clear command of Scripture is for those with power to steward their power for those who don't have it. And that means there's plenty for all of us to do. And so keeping our eye on the prize, our church decided to approach our city and really tackle foster care and adoption. Now, there are a number of ways to serve vulnerable children, and our small church can't do them all, but we have tackled that. And our church decided to tackle affordable housing, and that's a complex, difficult issue. And then we have some global things that we do as well. This is why I keep this journal, is almost every church I'm at is doing something innovative for the least of these. And then when you look at some of these amazing people who have been living and serving among the least for decades, I think of somebody like Gregory Boyle, who has the world's most famous gang rehab in Compton. You won't find a more cheerful, playful human than Greg Boyle. He has probably gone to more unnecessary teenage funerals than any of us with the gun violence. And yet there is a guy that's right in the midst of it and free. There's something to learn from a guy like that. On my Being Human podcast, I ask every guest, what is something the local church provides you can't get anywhere else? One of the most common answers is a variety of, like, this is my community. I didn't choose it. I would not choose to be in community with these people, but there's something great about that. So yeah, for people who are despairing, I still think, man, roll up your sleeves, find a local faith community that you can serve and they can serve you, and let's go.
May it be so. May we all be able to move past the anxiety that's standing in the way of reaching out and being with people that otherwise, like you said, we probably wouldn't. And how better to know and exhibit the love of Jesus. Steve Cuss, thank you for helping us make sense of our anxiety and this moment in which we find ourselves as followers of Jesus. Listeners, be sure to check out Steve's podcast, Being Human. We'll put a link in the show notes. And remember to join Curtis Chang and the rest of us at Good Faith when we gather again around the campfire.